The morning of June 20th, 1837, in England was one charged with anxiety and anticipation. King William IV, the Old King, was dying at Windsor Castle. His last breaths would change the destiny of an entire nation. He had no direct legitimate heirs. The succession would pass to a young girl, not yet 18 years old, Alexandrina Victoria. In the early hours of the following morning, June 21st, while a thick fog enveloped London, a group of senior officials and statesmen slipped into the young princess's home at Kensington. They woke her from her sleep to inform her that her uncle the king had passed away, and that she was now Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. Historical accounts say Victoria received the news with astonishing steadiness and maturity beyond her years. She knew her life had changed forever. At that moment, a new era began. The Victorian Age. Victoria was an only child who had grown up under a strict system and close surveillance under what was known as the Kensington system, imposed by her ambitious mother, the Duchess of Kent, and the cunning advisor, Sir John Conroy. The goal was to weaken her will and make her completely dependent on them when she became queen. But Victoria, in one of her first steps toward independence, insisted on sleeping in a room alone after her coronation, and ordered her bed to be moved away from her mother's room. This was a powerful symbolic gesture, a clear declaration of the beginning of her personal rule. On July 10th, the coronation ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey. The scenes in the streets were breathtaking. Thousands of citizens gathered to see their new queen, this small young woman with a round face and wide blue eyes. There was great hope that this young queen would bring fresh blood and a modern perspective to a kingdom teetering on the brink of major transformations. The Britain Victoria inherited was not a stable or tranquil state. It was still finding its way after the long Napoleonic Wars. The Industrial Revolution was pushing the economy forward at an astonishing rate, but it was also causing great social chaos. Cities were growing at an unprecedented pace, creating health problems and hardships for the poor working class. There were protests and unrest demanding political reforms, most notably the Chartist movement, which called for voting rights for men of all classes. Amid this storm, the young queen needed support and guidance. She found this support in her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, the charismatic veteran politician. Melbourne became a father, teacher, and political advisor to Victoria. He guided her in state affairs, explained the complexities of politics to her, and shaped her worldview. Their relationship was so strong that it aroused the jealousy of many at court, who saw it as an excessive influence on the young queen. But the biggest personal turning point in Victoria's early life was her meeting with her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The families arranged the meeting with the aim of marriage. Upon seeing him for the first time, Victoria wrote in her famous diary, "I saw Albert, who is beautifully unspeakable." Albert was a handsome, intelligent, serious young man with a scientific and organized mind. They married on February 10th, 1840, in a relatively simple ceremony at St. James's Palace. This marriage was the most important factor that would shape not only Victoria's character, but also the fate of the nation. Contrary to expectations, Albert did not content himself with a quiet background role as husband. With intelligence and patience, he became her partner in ruling, in every sense of the word. He was her first and closest advisor. He brought order and efficiency to the affairs of the royal household. He encouraged the arts and sciences and was the mastermind behind the Great Exhibition of 1851. Gradually, Albert transformed the image of the monarchy from merely a political institution into a symbol of family, morality, and stability. Together, they established the model of the ideal royal family that became an example for the expanding middle class. And so in these early years, the foundations were laid upon which the entire Victorian age would stand. A young queen transformed into an icon, a royal marriage that became a legend, and a nation on the verge of radical change, standing between the traditions of the past and the hopes of the future, between the palaces of the aristocrats and the dens of the poor, between the noise of machines and the voice of those demanding rights. The dawn of a new era had broken, both bright and dark at once, full of the contradictions that would define the identity of the coming century. Chapter 2. Victorian Britain was the world's great workshop, a place that never slept or rested. There was nowhere else on earth like it. The nation had transformed from a quiet agricultural society into an industrial giant, roaring with all its might. This was the beating heart of the Victorian age, the era of machines, smoke, and iron. The main driver of this astonishing transformation was the steam engine. These great machines, emitting steam and high-pitched whistles, became the new symbol of power. Power was no longer measured by the number of horses or soldiers, but by the steam horsepower possessed by factories, ships, and locomotives. In factories, machines replaced manual labor in tasks that used to take months, now producing goods in hours. Textile mills in cities like Manchester and Leeds produced fabrics in enormous quantities, supplying the empire and exporting to every corner of the world. But the greatest symbol of progress was the railway. A network of iron tracks began to cover the face of the country, connecting cities to the countryside and ports to industrial centers. The phrase, "train arriving," was the new sound of progress. Building the railways was a great adventure, requiring thousands of workers to cut through hills, dig tunnels, and erect huge iron bridges. When a steam locomotive passed, it shook the ground beneath one's feet, emitting black smoke into the sky, traveling at a speed never before experienced by mankind. The railways made travel accessible to everyone, although first class was for the rich and third class for the poor. This rapid industrial expansion attracted hundreds of thousands of people from the countryside to the cities. Cities grew enormously and at a frightening pace. Cities like Birmingham, Sheffield, and Glasgow became crowded population centers. But this growth came at a high price. Working-class neighborhoods were clusters of cramped, narrow houses, built quickly and with the cheapest materials. The streets were narrow and dark, littered with garbage, with sewage flowing in open channels. In these neighborhoods, life was extremely difficult. Entire families lived in one small, damp and cold room. Diseases spread rapidly, especially cholera and tuberculosis. The air in industrial cities was heavy with coal dust and soot, causing respiratory problems for many. Work in the factories was dangerous and arduous. Men, women, and even children worked very long hours, up to 16 hours a day, for meager wages that barely bought food. Child labor was one of the darkest aspects of this period. Young children, some no more than 5 years old, worked in factories and coal mines. They worked in tight spaces under large machinery, putting them in constant danger. Many of them lost limbs or even their lives in horrific accidents. Education was a luxury they could not afford. Their destiny was to work from childhood. But Victorian Britain was also a land of contradictions. While workers lived in misery, factory owners and merchants built luxurious mansions on the outskirts of cities. They displayed their wealth through fancy clothes, large houses, and extravagant parties. They were the leaders of the new society, a class of businessmen who owned economic power. The pinnacle of pride of this period was the Great Exhibition, held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London, in 1851. This exhibition was the idea of Prince Albert, who wanted Britain to show the world its leadership in industry and arts. The Crystal Palace was a huge building of glass and iron, seeming as if it were from the future. Inside this palace, products from across the empire and from countries around the world were displayed. Modern machines, beautiful textiles, artistic masterpieces, and stunning craftsmanship. Millions visited this exhibition from all social classes and were amazed and proud of the progress humanity had achieved. Thus, the Industrial Revolution was the force that shaped the Victorian age. It created unprecedented wealth and made Britain the most powerful nation in the world. But it also created a deep social divide and great human suffering. The rise of the machines was accompanied by the rise of the capitalists, while the working class paid the price. This contradiction between material progress and social misery would define many of the conflicts and reforms in the following decades, and would create a legacy of social problems whose effects are still felt today. It was an era of smoke and iron, of construction and suffering, of hope and despair. Chapter 3. Victorian England was a land of stark contrasts. Two separate worlds existed side by side, yet they rarely met. On one hand, there was a life of elegance and luxury in opulent mansions. On the other, there was harsh suffering in dark, impoverished slums. These two faces were the daily reality of the age. Let us begin with the face of light, the world of the upper classes. The lives of the wealthy were highly organized according to strict rules. A rich man's day began with a large breakfast in his spacious home. Then he would go to his work, perhaps in his office or the factory he owned. The ladies, meanwhile, spent their days managing the large household and directing the numerous servants. It was customary to have servants for cooking, cleaning, and personal attendance for the lady and the children. Clothing was very important for displaying social status. Women wore dresses that were tight at the waist and wide at the hem, made from the finest silks. Men wore formal suits and top hats. The rules of behavior and etiquette were very strict. Everyone had to know how to behave on every occasion, from visiting friends to attending dance parties. The other face, the face of darkness, lived in crowded, poor neighborhoods. These neighborhoods consisted of narrow, winding streets, littered with filth. The houses were small and dilapidated, housing a large number of people. A family of 8 would live in one small room, used for sleeping, cooking, and living. Dampness filled the walls, and the air was cold in winter. The inhabitants of these neighborhoods worked in the most difficult professions. They were factory workers, street vendors, or street cleaners. Women worked in laundry or sewing for long hours for little pay. Children went out to work at an early age to help their families. Food was very simple for the poor. Bread and potatoes were the staple diet. Meat was considered a rare luxury. Often they would mix old bread with water to make a meal that would fill their stomachs. Hunger was a common ailment among children. Health was a major problem in these neighborhoods. There was no clean water, and diseases like cholera and tuberculosis spread rapidly. Hospitals were few and poorly equipped. Child mortality rates were very high. Between these two worlds, a new class began to emerge. The middle class. This class consisted of small shop owners, employees, engineers, and teachers. They did not possess the wealth of the rich, but they lived comfortable lives. They owned a small house with one maid and sent their children to school. Their values were based on hard work, saving, education, and respectability in society. The literature of the time played an important role in exposing this contradiction. Charles Dickens, a famous writer, wrote novels that vividly portrayed the lives of the poor. In his novel, Oliver Twist, he depicted the lives of homeless children and their work in sweatshops. In David Copperfield, he described the suffering of a poor child working in a factory. These books were widely read and helped increase awareness about the lives of the poor. But life was not easy for any of the classes. Even the rich were bound by strict social rules. Girls from wealthy families married according to the family's wishes, not for love. Men had to hide their emotions and maintain a strong appearance at all times. Thus, Victorian England was a deeply divided society. Industrial progress created great wealth, but this wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. There was a surplus of goods in the markets, yet millions lived in extreme poverty. This contradiction was the greatest challenge of Victorian society. It was a world of two separate castes living in the same city, yet not seeing each other. There was a face of light and prosperity, and another of darkness and suffering, and both were part of the single reality that was England at that time. Chapter 4. In the Victorian era, Britain was not merely an ordinary European nation. It was a superpower whose control extended to every corner of the globe. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire, because at every moment of the day, the sun was shining on some British territory. This vast empire was a source of great pride for the British people, but it was also a story of control, power, and exploitation. India was the crown jewel of this empire. The British East India Company had managed India's affairs for many years, but after a major rebellion in 1857, known as the Indian Mutiny, the British government took direct control of India. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, and India became Britain's most important colony. India supplied Britain with vast wealth. It exported cotton, tea, spices, and precious jewels. The British built a massive railway network in India and established schools that taught the English language and British culture. However, life for Indians was difficult under British rule. New laws imposed high taxes on them, and British products flooded the markets, harming local industries. At the same time, Britain was expanding across the African continent. Africa was considered the cake that European nations wanted to divide among themselves. The British wanted to control sea routes and natural resources. Britain occupied vast regions in East and South Africa. The figure of Cecil Rhodes was the symbol of this expansion in Africa. He was a businessman and politician who strongly believed in imperialism. He dreamed of building a railway from Cape Town in the south to Cairo in the north, all under British control. Although this dream was never fully realized, his efforts helped secure control over vast territories. However, the expansion was not always peaceful. In South Africa, Britain fought two fierce wars against Dutch settlers known as the Boers. The Boer War was long and costly, revealing that the British army was not as strong as previously believed. The British used harsh tactics in this war, including placing civilians in concentration camps, where thousands died from disease and starvation. There was an ideological justification for this colonial expansion, known as the white man's burden. This idea claimed that it was the duty of the white man in Europe to civilize and modernize the backward peoples of Asia and Africa. They believed they were bringing progress, education, Christianity, and good governance to these peoples. In reality, This justification hid the true desire to control lands and resources and increase British power. Managing an empire of this size was no easy task. Britain controlled its colonies in several ways. In some regions, it installed direct British rulers. In others, it cooperated with local rulers, leaving them some authority under British supervision. The British Navy, the strongest in the world, protected trade routes and transported soldiers and goods. The empire brought enormous wealth to Britain. Cheap raw materials arrived from the colonies, and Britain sold them manufactured goods at high prices. This made Britain very rich and powerful. However, this wealth came at the expense of other peoples. Their resources were exploited, their traditions marginalized, and their lives forcibly changed. The empire also changed Britain itself. Foreign products like tea and sugar became available to everyone. Great exhibitions displayed products from all over the world. British soldiers and officials went to the colonies and returned with stories of strange lands and different peoples. But by the end of the Victorian era, new challenges began to emerge. Other nations like Germany and France competed with Britain for colonial expansion. Local peoples began demanding independence and self-rule. The Boer War showed that maintaining the empire was very costly in both money and lives. Thus, the British Empire was the greatest achievement of the Victorian age, and its greatest contradiction. It was a source of strength and wealth, but also of conflict and injustice. It changed the world forever and left a complex legacy that still affects relationships between nations to this day. It was an era of national pride, but also of arrogance and limitless power. Chapter 5. In the mid-19th century, the stable foundations of Victorian society began to shake under the influence of bold new ideas. This period witnessed a deep conflict between traditional beliefs and scientific discoveries that changed humanity's understanding of itself and the world around it. The most important event in this conflict was the publication of Charles Darwin's famous book on the origin of species in 1859. In his book, Darwin presented the theory of evolution through natural selection. This theory proposed that all living beings, including humans, evolved from common ancestors over millions of years. This idea was shocking to a society accustomed to interpreting creation as described in the Bible. The reaction to Darwin's theory was strong and varied. Many clergymen attacked the theory as blasphemy and a challenge to religious teachings. They argued it robbed humanity of its special place in creation. On the other hand, many scientists and intellectuals saw the theory as a powerful scientific explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. This debate led to a conflict between science and religion that continued for many years. But Darwin was not alone in shaking old certainties. The geological sciences provided evidence that the Earth was much older than previously accepted. Fossils and bones of extinct animals buried in layers of earth over millions of years were discovered. These discoveries challenged the traditional six-day creation story. During the same period, some thinkers began to question miracles and religious stories. Philosophers and scientists studied religious texts with critical methodology, as if they were ordinary historical texts. They tried to separate historical facts from myths and symbols. This approach angered the traditional religious establishment. Despite these challenges, religious faith did not disappear. Many people tried to reconcile science and religion. They argued that the theory of evolution did not deny the existence of a creator, but only showed the method by which this creator worked. Others turned to more rational forms of faith, moving away from literal interpretations of religious texts. Scientific progress was not limited to biology and geology alone. This period saw inventions that profoundly changed people's lives. The invention of the telegraph made communication between continents possible in minutes instead of months. The emergence of photography allowed the world to be documented as it was for the first time in history. The invention of the electric light bulb and the telephone was on the horizon. These inventions reinforced faith in the power of the human mind and its ability to understand and improve the world. But they also increased the pace and complexity of life. The world became smaller and faster, creating a sense of anxiety and rapid change for many. In the medical field, Louis Pasteur presented the germ theory that explained diseases. This discovery led to significant improvements in public hygiene and surgery, saving millions of lives. But it also undermined ancient beliefs about the causes of diseases that were linked to evil spirits or God's wrath. Thus, this period was a true intellectual earthquake. Victorian man lost the simple certainties his ancestors had lived by. He now had to find his way in a more complex world, where multiple interpretations of the origin and meaning of life competed. This was a conflict between a mind burning with questions and a soul skeptical of ready-made answers. This conflict was not easy, but it led to a deeper understanding of nature and humanity. It laid the foundations of the modern world, where science occupies a central place, but the big questions about meaning and purpose remain open to debate. It was a revolution in thought, no less important than the Industrial Revolution in its impact on humanity's destiny. Chapter 6. In Victorian society, women's lives were governed by strict rules and specific expectations. The ideal image of a woman was the angel in the house, a good, pure, devoted woman who dedicated her life to her husband's comfort and her children's upbringing. But behind this calm image, there was another story of struggle for rights and identity. Young girls learned from an early age that their role in life was to become wives and mothers. The education they received focused on domestic skills like sewing, cooking, and playing the piano, in addition to basic reading and writing. There was no encouragement for deep education or critical thinking. The prevailing belief was that higher education could harm a woman's mind and make her less feminine. Upon marriage, a woman lost many of her legal rights. According to the law, a married woman's legal identity merged with her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or file lawsuits. Everything she owned became her husband's property. Even her wages, if she worked outside the home, belonged to her husband. But not all women were content with this situation. Voices began to emerge demanding changes to these unjust laws. A group of courageous women campaigned for what were called the Married Women's Property Acts. After a long struggle, some successes were achieved. In 1857, the first law was passed, allowing married women to keep the wages they earned from their work. In the field of education, there were slow but steady advances. The first women's colleges opened at Cambridge and Oxford universities. Although these colleges were separate and did not initially grant fully recognized degrees, they represented an important beginning for women's higher education. Pioneering women like Emily Davies and Barbara Bodichon were supporters of this educational movement. The medical field also saw an important struggle. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to receive a medical degree in modern times, forced to study in the United States because British universities refused to accept her. Upon her return to England, she helped establish the London School of Medicine for Women in 1874. But perhaps the most important women's movement of this period was the campaign for voting rights. Women paid taxes and were subject to laws, but had no say in electing those who made these laws. Groups of women began organizing campaigns to demand this basic right. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters were among the most prominent faces of this movement. They founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. This group used new and more direct methods than traditional women's societies. They organized marches and protests, boycotted public events, and even broke windows and damaged public property to draw attention to their cause. This movement faced strong opposition. Many men and even some women considered politics to be purely a male affair. Newspapers mocked the demands for women's suffrage. The government arrested protesters and violently beat some of them. Despite these difficulties, the women's movement gained momentum. Women were proving their capabilities in various fields. Florence Nightingale changed the concept of nursing during the Crimean War. Marie Curie was beginning her scientific journey that would lead her to win a Nobel Prize. Writers like George Eliot, real name Mary Ann Evans, wrote deep novels discussing women's position in society. By the end of the Victorian era, women had not yet gained full rights. The path to women's liberation was still long, but the seeds had been planted and the ideas had spread. A struggle for equality had begun that would continue into the 20th century, challenging old traditions and drawing a new picture of woman, not merely as an angel in the house, but as a complete human being with her own mind, will, and rights. Chapter 7. The Victorian era witnessed an unprecedented cultural and artistic renaissance that expressed the spirit of the age, with its contradictions, hopes, and challenges. From literary salons in London to art exhibitions in Manchester, creative forms of expression flourished, portraying the complexities of life during that period. In literature, the Victorian novel reached its peak. Novels published in weekly or monthly installments became a cultural phenomenon eagerly awaited by families. Charles Dickens was the most famous novelist of this era, portraying in works like Oliver Twist and David Copperfield the gap between social classes and the suffering of the poor in industrial cities. Dickens addressed social injustice in a moving style that combined humor and drama. Alongside Dickens, the Bronte sisters emerged with profound works exploring complex human emotions. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre portrayed a woman's struggle for independence and dignity in a society that restricted her freedom. Meanwhile, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights offered a deep psychological analysis of love and revenge. George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, wrote philosophical novels like Middlemarch, considered one of the greatest English novels, where she precisely analyzed human relationships and social development in a small rural community. In poetry, Lord Tennyson stood out, reflecting in his poems the Victorian spirit between pessimism and hope. He became poet laureate in 1850 and wrote poems expressing faith in human progress and scientific development. On the other hand, Robert Browning, in his dramatic poems, expressed the complexities and contradictions of the human soul. In visual art, the pre-Raphaelite movement emerged as a reaction to industrialization and artistic stagnation. This movement was founded by a group of young artists who sought to return to the honesty and precise technique that characterized arts before the Renaissance. Artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti and John Everett Millais presented works characterized by bright colors, precise details and themes derived from literature and history. This artistic movement rejected traditional styles and believed that art should express social and moral truths. Their paintings depicted scenes from daily life, in addition to themes from myths and English literature. This period also witnessed the birth of photography, which revolutionized how reality was documented. Early photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron began using this new technology to record images of the royal family, prominent figures, and daily scenes. Photography became an important means of documenting life in that era, in a realistic way never before possible. In theater, popular performances, comedies, and dramas flourished. Theaters in London became entertainment venues for everyone, from the aristocracy to workers. Plays were presented by writers like Oscar Wilde, who strongly criticized and mocked double Victorian social values. Cultural magazines like Punch also appeared, combining caricatures, literary articles, and social criticism. These magazines contributed to shaping public opinion and criticizing social phenomena in a humorous way. In music, home concerts spread where families gathered around the piano to sing folk songs and musical pieces. Opera and public concerts became part of cultural life in major cities. Thus, Victorian culture and arts expressed the spirit of an age oscillating between tradition and modernity, between faith and science, between wealth and poverty. The creators of this period left works that still today testify to the complexities and contradictions of one of the most important periods in English history. They created a rich cultural heritage that remains a testament to humanity's struggle to express itself in a rapidly changing world. Chapter 8. The mid-Victorian period witnessed a radical transformation in addressing the social and health problems left by the Industrial Revolution. After years of suffering and neglect, political and popular will began to emerge for reform and improvement of living conditions for the working classes. Industrial cities suffered from terrible overcrowding, with poor neighborhoods lacking the most basic amenities of decent living. Diseases spread terrifyingly due to water pollution, waste accumulation, and poor ventilation. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid claimed thousands of lives annually, indiscriminately affecting both poor and rich. In this climate, the role of social reformers who devoted their efforts to changing these conditions stood out. Edwin Chadwick was one of the most prominent of these reformers, leading a campaign to reform the sewage system in major cities. Through detailed reports, Chadwick proved a direct relationship between poor environmental conditions and the spread of disease. As a result of these efforts, the first Public Health Act was passed in 1848. This law established local health boards with the authority to provide clean water, build effective sewage systems, and regularly remove waste. Although the law's implementation was slow initially, it represented a turning point in the concept of community responsibility for public health. In the field of labor, the struggle to improve workers' conditions continued. A series of factory acts were issued aimed at protecting workers from exploitation. These laws set daily working hours, prohibited the employment of children below a certain age, and established safety standards in workplaces. The Factory Act of 1878 was one of the most important of these laws, as it consolidated and expanded previous legislation. This law set working hours at 10 hours per day for women and children, imposed mandatory safety measures in factories, and gave factory inspectors broader powers to ensure the implementation of these laws. In the field of education, this period witnessed important developments. A large number of working-class children were deprived of education due to their need to work to help their families. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 established primary schools in areas lacking them and made education available to all children between the ages of 5 and 12. This period also saw improvements in the justice and legal system. The prison system was reformed, and rehabilitative institutions were established instead of relying on harsh punishments. Laws were passed allowing workers to organize themselves into unions, giving them better bargaining power with employers. In the field of housing, initiatives began to emerge to improve workers' housing. Charitable cooperative associations were established to build healthy housing at reasonable prices for working families. Although these efforts were limited in scope, they represented the beginning of attention to the relationship between decent housing and health and social stability. The first social care institutions were also established to help the elderly, poor, and disabled. The concept of care transitioned from being a voluntary charitable work to an organized community responsibility. These reforms were not easy to implement and faced opposition from some employers who saw them as additional costs and interference in freedom of work. But popular pressure and scientific evidence of the importance of these reforms led to a gradual change in public opinion and government policies. These reforms did not solve all the social problems of the Victorian era, but they represented an important beginning for society's transformation toward assuming responsibility for its members. They laid the foundations for the idea that economic progress should be accompanied by improved living conditions for all social classes, and that public health, education, and decent living conditions are fundamental rights rather than privileges. Chapter 9. As the Victorian era approached its end, cracks began to appear in the wall of traditional values upon which it was built. The last 2 decades of the 19th century witnessed deep transformations that shook society's confidence in itself and revealed a gap between Victorian ideals and changing reality. The Jack the Ripper case that shook London in 1888 was a harsh blow to the collective consciousness. The brutal murders revealed not only the extreme poverty of Whitechapel, but also the failure of state institutions to protect its citizens. Widely circulated newspapers reported the details of the crimes in all their brutality, creating a state of panic and suspicion in the city that considered itself the center of civilization. In the economic field, British industrial dominance began to face strong competition from other countries. Germany and the United States began competing with Britain in world markets with newer and cheaper industrial products. This led to an economic depression and rising unemployment, increasing social tensions. New social movements emerged, challenging the existing system. Labor unions gained strength and better organization, organizing major strikes demanding improved wages and working conditions. At the same time, socialist ideas began to spread among intellectuals and workers, calling for redistribution of wealth and radical change in the economic system. In the world of literature and art, creators began to move away from the previous idealistic tone. Writers like Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw mocked the moral hypocrisy and social restrictions of the Victorian era. Thomas Hardy's novels portrayed a harsh life with no room for divine justice or guaranteed happiness. The colonial sciences began to face increasing resistance. In India and Africa, national movements emerged, demanding independence and self-rule. The Boer War in South Africa cost Britain heavy human and material losses, revealing the limitations of British military power. Even the monarchy was not immune to criticism. After Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria withdrew from public life for a long period, weakening the popularity of the monarchy. Some began to question the usefulness of a monarchical system in the era of emerging democracies. Scientific progress continued to challenge traditional beliefs. Darwin's theories about evolution continued to provoke controversy, while new discoveries in physics and chemistry began to paint a picture of the universe more complex and mysterious than the simple religious image. Victorian women began to break restrictions in new ways. Increased educational and work opportunities for women from the middle classes gave them greater autonomy. The women's suffrage movement became more organized and vocal, despite the strong opposition it faced. In the cities, problems of poverty and overcrowding persisted, but now became more visible due to the press and social reports. Images of the poor were no longer hidden, but became subjects of study and public debate. By the end of the last decade of the century, Victorian society was living in a state of stark contradiction. On one hand, technological progress and unprecedented wealth, and on the other, poverty and social conflicts. On one hand, faith in progress and civilization, and on the other, doubt and anxiety about the future. This was not the sudden end of the Victorian world, but rather a gradual transition from the certainties of the past to the doubts of the future. It was the end of the innocence of an era that thought it had found final answers for everything, and the beginning of a more complex era that accepted questions more than answers. Chapter 10. As the 20th century dawned, Victorian Britain prepared for its final farewell. Queen Victoria, who had embodied the spirit of an entire age, was breathing her last at Osborne House. On January 22, 1901, the Queen passed away after a reign lasting 63 years and 7 months, closing with her departure one of the longest chapters in British history. Victoria's funeral was a majestic event, blending ancient traditions with emerging modernity. A special funeral train carried her coffin across the lands of the Empire where the sun never set. Millions of subjects lined the roadsides to bid farewell to the Queen they had lived under throughout their lives. It was not merely the farewell to a ruler, but the end of an entire epoch. National mourning extended beyond Britain to all imperial territories. From Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa, millions wore black in mourning for the grandmother of Europe, as she was called. Newspapers worldwide devoted their front pages to narrating the Queen's biography and reviewing her era's achievements. Edward VII, who had been heir apparent for the longest period in British history, suddenly found himself king of a vast empire at 59. His task was daunting, leading Britain into the new century while preserving his mother's great legacy. The world Edward inherited was radically different from the one Victoria was born into. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the country's face. The empire had reached its greatest extent, but new challenges loomed on the horizon. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany threatened British naval hegemony, and the United States began emerging as an economic superpower. British society itself was changing. The middle class had grown and become more powerful. Labor movements had organized themselves better, and women demanded greater rights. All these changes required a new approach to governance. Arts and culture began liberating themselves from Victorian constraints. Writers and artists dared address subjects previously considered taboo. Architecture transitioned from Victorian Gothic style to more modern and simpler patterns. Technology was accelerating life's pace. Cars began replacing horse-drawn carriages. Airplanes were conducting their first flight experiments, and wireless communications heralded a new era of connectivity. Despite all these changes, Victoria's legacy remained powerfully present. The constitutional monarchy system she helped build, the family values she promoted, and the political stability that characterized her reign all became part of the British national fabric. The Edwardian era that followed, though different in many aspects, carried much of the Victorian legacy within it. The traditions and values Victoria established continued influencing British life for decades to come. Today, looking back at the Victorian era, we see a world of fascinating contradictions. Industrial progress and technological innovation alongside extreme poverty. Vast imperial expansion alongside local social problems. Strict family values alongside increasing intellectual liberation. The twilight of the Victorian era was not an end, but a transition to a new epoch. It was a period where Britain laid the foundations for the modern world, with all its achievements and failures, all its progress and challenges. Victoria's departure marked the end of a great chapter, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing story of the British nation.